You picked up two things when you walked in.
Sorry.
All right. One, we are getting started on what is essentially Unit 9. That consists of chapters 20, 21, 22, and 23. And chapter 21 and 22 kind of blend together. You picked up two things. One was a sheet that on the front has kind of the main objectives for chapter 20 and some of the key vocabulary terms you should be aware of. I'm not doing a top 10 list, top 20, top 25. I'm not doing a top anything list for chapter 20. Okay? We're going to work on document usage this semester. That is going to be the predominant of our homework, is going to be document, working with documents. On the flip side of that sheet was the review sheet for the Unit 9 test. You now have it ahead of time, way ahead of time. Okay? Hopefully that test will come in the next 2.5 weeks, hopefully. The other thing you picked up was the homework assignment. Please take a look at it. It represents what we're going to try and concentrate on. You all have had, believe it or not, copious experience writing free response questions. Taking a question, coming up with a thesis, developing an argument, plugging in specific information to reinforce that argument, explaining the significance, explaining how and why it defends the thesis you've done. If you can do a free response question, you can certainly do a document-based question. Document-based questions are easy because you've got documents there. So even if you can't think of anything in terms of outside information, you've got documents that help inspire outside information. You read this document, it makes you think of this thing. You read that document, it makes you think of that thing. So, the first homework assignment you're going to do here is I've taken what is generally considered to be a popular question that deals with Chapter 20 and the topic of imperialism and America's quest for empire outside of the Western Hemisphere. The question is, to what extent, how much, to what extent was the imperialism of the late 19th century a continuation or a departure from previous American expansion seen earlier in the 1800s? So, first of all, you'd have to think about, well, what does this American expansion in the late 19th century entail? And there would be things that pop into your head. Oh, yeah, Spanish-American War, acquisition of Hawaii, open door policy in China, the building of a two-ocean navy, the building of the Panama Canal, those things. That's late 19th century, early 20th century American foreign policy. Is that a continuation of what came before? And then you'd need to think, well, what came before? Manifest destiny, acquiring land, land through treaty, land through war. Can I take my slaves there? Subjugation of the Native Americans, all that sort of stuff. That represents the foreign policy up until the late 19th century. I always put the dividing line at like 1890. That's when the Census Department declares the frontier closed in 1890. So then my question is, what are the new frontiers? Is it the Pacific Ocean? Is it Central America? Is it the Caribbean? So, does what you see at the turn of the century represent a continuation of what came before, or does it represent something different? That's the question. Now, I've provided you with a thesis, okay? So, here's an example of a good thesis. The annexation of Hawaii in 1896 represented a continuation of previous expansion policy. America saw additional territory with valuable resources, in this case, pineapples and sugar, and chose to annex the economically profitable territory despite the objections of Queen Liliuokalani. All right, so it's not a thesis. It's an example of what I'm looking for, okay? So I looked at one. It's been a while since I've looked at this sheet, about a week. So what I did was I provided you an example of what I'm looking for in the next 5 slides, okay? So I looked at the annexation of Hawaii, one of the events covered in Chapter 20, and I made a determination. I think it represents a continuation, and I explained how and why it represents a continuation, okay? So you're going to look at 5 other things that occur in this Chapter 20, late 19th century, early 20th century foreign policy. You're going to provide 4 things, 4 specific outside pieces of information. The 5th slot, number 5, okay? The 5th piece of evidence must use one of the documents between pages 213 and 215 in the workbook. So what you do is you look at those documents and you decide, does this represent a continuation or a departure? Here's what I would like you to do. I would like you to develop an argument. Pick one, continuation, and argue. Every piece of evidence you use should represent a continuation. Or pick departure. How does each one of these things represent a departure? So you pick one, continuation or departure, and then provide me with 5 pieces of evidence done in the way that I just did in that example. So you can't just write annexation of Hawaii. You got to do something more with it. You got to show me how to express it. And I provided you with an example of how to do it. The 5th slot must include a document. Must include information from a document. Now, I am sure that a lot of you have been through AP World, and you were taught to quote, were you taught to quote swaths of the document? Good, don't. Your job is not to regurgitate the document to me. Your job is not to be a human Xerox machine and copy the document. Your job is to read the document and figure out what the main idea is. What's the gist of the document? Now you do that by A-tipping it. Think about who the author is, what the time and place is, what's the main idea, what's the purpose. I know it's been a while since you've heard A-tip. But you've got to consider those things when you're analyzing a document to figure out, what's this document about? What is it trying to convey to me? And does the information that it conveys, in this case, represent a continuation or a departure? How does it represent a continuation or departure? Why does it represent a continuation or departure? Does that make sense? Let's take a look at a document. Well, first of all, let's explain what imperialism is. Imperialism, the long and short of it is domination. America seeks to dominate. Now, to what extent was late 19th and early 20th century United States expansionism a continuation of past expansionism, domination? To what extent was it a departure? So let's take a look at a document. Okay, let's see what the document reveals to us. Look at the author. Look at the time and place, and or place. We don't know the main idea. We don't know the purpose. But look at where the words come from. What's the significance of the person that it comes from? He's the president. But look at when it was written. 1903. What's the significance? He's dead. He's been shot. He was assassinated 2 years previously. So this is somebody writing down their recollections of what William McKinley said 2 years, but at least 2 years ago. People having fond memories of William McKinley. Yes. Nobody in there knows who William McKinley is. Here's the quote. Read it. Be thinking to yourself, does it represent a continuation or a departure? The good student can argue both sides. It's like the good lawyer can argue both sides of a case. The good student can argue that this both represents a continuation and a departure. You've got to pick one. Okay. How is it a continuation? What does, yes, go ahead. Okay. The idea of Christianizing Filipinos sounds very much like the assimilation of Native Americans that was done, and this gives you an opportunity to include a piece of outside information here. Dawes Act, 1887. Very good. Very good. What else? Continuation. Go ahead. Okay. Acquisition. Land. Acquire land. Sure. In this case, the Philippines, they're islands, but yeah, we're acquiring more stuff. Absolutely. What else? Anything else continuation-wise? Okay. We don't have a lot of time. So move on to the next thing. Departure. Go ahead, Kramer. Okay. Imbued, I love the word imbued, with morality. To which I would then argue, weren't we trying to Christianize the Indians too? Isn't that imbued with morality? Are we trying to, as General Sheridan once said, take the savage out of, kill the savage, save the savage?
But,
Go ahead.
I think it's more like the Native Americans, they're more interested in doing it because they didn't want like savages running around in their land.
Absolutely.
Here, he actually he views it as like their Christian duty
By Anne's Burden? Heard of that, I would hope. Rudyard Kipling. How else does this represent a departure? How?
It's outside the continent.
Yeah. What are we doing outside? I mean, we're like right next door to China. We're all up to use your parlance. We're all up in Asia's business. What in the world are we doing there? We're in their backyard. Go ahead.
It's more of a peaceful way instead of just going and taking it, trying to.
It sounds very peaceful there. Sounds very peaceful. The reality is very much different. But it sounds peaceful. It sounds benign. Benign and a half. Yeah.
He's not really taking into account the economic benefits. Like in the West, we were like mining and getting all sorts of money.
Yeah. So
I guess, agreeing with David, more morally
It's
driven.
more morally motivated rather than economically motivated. Okay, and that may be what you're getting from this, and that's fine because look, one, you don't have a lot of time to analyze all the documents for a DBQ. Two, you don't have to use all the documents for the DBQ. It's not like AP World. You don't have to use all the documents and then try to figure out what the missing document is and then try to figure out what the point of view is and all that other crap that AP World wants you to do. You don't have to do that. It's the last year you don't have to do that, but you don't have to do that. Next year it's going to be totally different. So you just have to get the gist. And if you are making an argument that American imperialism represents a continuation, you can use this document to say, McKinley's attitude very much looks like the assimilation of Native Americans under the Dawes Act, which had just occurred only, 16 years previous? So that's a policy that's fresh in people's minds. But if you say this is outside the Western Hemisphere, it breaks with the tradition of staying within the Western Hemisphere, a la the Monroe Doctrine. I'm just trying to find ways to throw words with capital letters in my essay. You could say that. You could bring in white man's burden. You could bring in this idea of duty to Christianize. By the way, here's my take on William McKinley. He is a dope. He is an idiot. He does not know what he is doing. He is not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And trust me, we have had presidents who couldn't find a sentence with both hands and a flashlight, okay? It doesn't make them bad presidents. It just makes them not very smart, okay? William McKinley is talking about Christianizing people who had been Catholic for 400 years. They already knew the baby Jesus. So this is what happens, folks. We get involved in places around the world dealing with people and we don't know who we're dealing with. And then we're shocked when we get blowback, which is something we're going to get in the Philippines. When we try to, whenever I think of us going in the Philippines, I always think of the movie Mars Attacks. The Martians, we are your friends, we are your friends, we are your friends. Vaporizing everybody. But that's essentially what happened. We went in there and we started just killing people to assimilate them. And we were in the Philippines for like 5 years. We waterboarded people. We tortured people. We were killing boys at the age of 10. We turned into these monsters in order to create a greater good. No Hot Fuzz fans out there? Really? I'm going to tell you right now, you need to stop doing AP US history and just go right now and watch some movies. Start with the Cornetto trilogy and go from there.
Well, after the AP test.
Yes! Oh, yeah! And go watch the Lego movie. The Lego movie's excellent.
Did your son want to go see that?
I took my son and 8 of his friends yesterday to go see the Lego movie.
Hey, I went to
Nuts!
Just the spread that Ron didn't run into. I went to see Ron.
Nuts! Anyway, let's take a look here at how I chose to use this document. And notice that I did not copy the document. William McKinley said, quote, blah, 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 unquote. I used the document. So you missed this. I missed this. I missed us. But this is how I used the document. Now listen to the mellifluous tone with which which this is written. It sounds good. Despite being a half a world away, America's interest in the Philippines definitely represented a continuation. I made sure I referenced the question. The question asked about continuation or departure. I made sure I used the key word in the question. Represented a continuation of previous expansion in the vein of antebellum manifest destiny. The fact that President McKinley wanted to educate and civilize, those are the only two words I used from the document. What he considered to be an unchristian race echoes the attempts at assimilation of Native Americans that had just been attempted with the passage of the Dawes Act a decade earlier. So, I have analyzed the document and used what I gleaned from the document, what I learned from the document. I took what I learned, I applied it to the question, I explained how and why this represents a continuation or a departure, and I also managed to infuse outside information. Capital letters stuff that I remember, names, dates, policies, whatever. I try to infuse as many as I possibly can. The only way I can do that is if I know the material. The reason why you people write with a lot of generalities or you write in the passive voice is because you're unsure of what you're talking about. So you skirt around in your writing. The more you know the material, the more direct your writing will be. And here's my piece of advice to all of you. Every sentence you write should mean or say something specific. It should be able to be extracted out of your essay, put on its own, and convey something specific. If it doesn't, it's BS. Get rid of it. It has no place in your essay. If that sentence cannot stand on its own, then it has no place in your essay. It's just filler. It's one of the best pieces of advice I can give you as you go to college. Okay? So does everybody see how and then in my essay I would put, if this was Doc A. There you go. Moving on, next thing. And I've used the document. Did not quote it. Wrote it in the past tense. Infused outside information into it. There you go. Look, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years. Okay? It becomes easy to me. It's like second nature to me. For you guys, you may be looking at this going, oh my God, I can't do this. But this is the basis of this is a building block of every paper you will write in college. How do I take the data that I've got, whether it's numerical data, chemical data, physical data, English data, history data, and how do I construct a compelling argument with it? You've got to know the material, and you've got to have a passing mastery of the English language. That's another problem you guys are facing. That's another obstacle. All right. Are you good? Are you see? Are we good? Any questions, concerns? I wanted to show you how what it looked like. All right. Terrible. What time are we out of here? We know? I feel like I just got you guys. Well, whatever. All right. We'll get to what we can get to. All right. So let's take a look at some of the things that occur during this time, okay? Some things that we could use to support an argument. The idea of looking for new frontiers. When Frederick Jackson Turner declares, or when the Census Department declares the frontier closed in 1890, and Frederick Jackson Turner writes his frontier thesis, which essentially the argument of the frontier thesis is what? Frontier life creates democracy. That's the very short thesis. Frontier life creates democracy because it's all hands on deck. Everybody needs to be there participating. That's why you have a democracy. The question then becomes, what are the new frontiers? People believe that America has evolved into a fit society, the fittest society. And there is this general belief among the Western world that the fittest societies had a right to dominate less fit societies. They applied the idea of Darwin's theories of evolution to it and said society evolves in very much the same way. Now, it comes from actually an American named Herbert Spencer. He's one of the fathers of sociology. And by the way, if you're looking to take a really good elective course that doesn't really have a lot of stringent work in it like this class, sociology is really a good one to take. I love teaching sociology. Anyway, Mr. Holt, you had sociology. Testimonial. It's awesome! Fantastic. All right. So anyway, social Darwinism, this belief that we had a right. England had a right. France had a right. Germany had a right. Africans did not have a right. Asians did not have a right. The argument of Josiah Strong and others like him in a book called Our Country, what I would call the WASP argument, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant argument. Josiah Strong believed that Christians had a duty to bring civilization to the uncivilized masses. You could somehow marry the McKinley quote with the Josiah Strong argument, and you could say, William McKinley, perhaps influenced by Josiah Strong in Our Country, believed that the Americans had a right or a duty to Christianize and civilize the Philippines. And then Alfred Thayer Mahan, another influential writer of the time, influential thinker. Mahan and John Paul Jones are the cornerstones of the Naval Academy. And isn't Mahan buried up there? I know John Paul Jones is buried in this big, huge sarcophagus. Isn't Mahan also buried up there? I think he is. But the two of them are like the fathers of the Naval Academy. Mahan is the guy who argues that in order for America to continue being the strongest economic power in the world, America had to be the strongest military power in the world to defend its economic interests around the globe. And the only way you can do that is with a two-ocean navy. A navy capable of operating in the Atlantic and the Pacific and getting anywhere around the globe at a moment's notice. The influence of sea power upon history. What Mahan argues is that when England became an economic power 300 years previous, the way it did it was by dominating the seas, dominating the trade routes, dominating where goods could and couldn't go. So if America wants to be this economic power, which by 1900, America is the largest economic power in the world. It has supplanted Great Britain. Mahan argues that we need a large ocean-going, two-ocean navy to defend our economic interests. So, you've got social Darwinism, feelings of Christian duty, the desire to dominate economic markets around the globe and protect those economic markets. We're also looking to cement hemisphere. Oh God, I'm just throwing all the big words out, the big SAT words. We're also looking to cement hemispheric hegemony. Oh, I missed this. It's intellectual. Hegemony is just a fancy word for dominance. I didn't know that word till I went to college, okay? Hegemony. I looked at that word and I was like, hegemony? What's hegemony? I'm in college. Hegemony? What's hegemony? Sounded like an idiot. Hegemony. America is the hegemon of the Western Hemisphere. It is the supreme power of the Western Hemisphere. We are looking to cement that power. And throughout the 19th century, that is America's goal. Acquire land, manifest destiny, subsume lesser peoples, whether that's the Hispanics in the Mexican cession, the Native Americans on the frontier, or whomever. Desire for a canal in Central America. They were originally going to build the thing through Nicaragua in the 1850s. What was happening? Does anybody remember Nicaragua in the 1850s? Yeah, I just saw people go, oh, yeah, I remember something about Nicaragua in the 1850s. Anybody remember filibustering expeditions? William Walker, we're going down, we're taking over Latin American countries. Not just for the expansion of slave states, but because we've also got our eye on building a canal through Nicaragua. We even signed a treaty with Great Britain in 1850. One of the few things that's actually done during the Taylor administration is the signing of something called the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, where America and Great Britain agree that it is in the world's best interest to build a canal through Central America. So America's had its eye on Central America and building a canal. I mean, when's the Panama Canal open? 1914? So for 64 years, America's had its eye on Central America. Wouldn't it be great if there was a canal through that? Get rid of European interlopers. Get rid of Europeans in the Western Hemisphere. Any opportunity we have to get rid of Europeans, we're going to try to take it. For instance, the Monroe Doctrine. Spain is essentially kicked out of the Western Hemisphere except for a couple of territories. The Latin American countries rise up against Spain, overthrow their Spanish overlords, and declare independence, and America's right there to help them out and take their stuff. But help them out and take their stuff. In 1864, did you know France invaded Mexico? Were you aware that France was invading Mexico in 1864? What's going on in 1864? The Civil War! While the cat's away, the mice will play. While America is otherwise occupied, France decides, well now, why don't we try to take some territory in the Western Hemisphere? America certainly isn't going to fight back. As a matter of fact, Southerners, members of the Southern government, went to the Lincoln administration and said, why don't we put this Civil War aside and we'll team up against France? Which any day sounds like a good idea. But that was a proposal. To end the Civil War was to team up against the French that had invaded Mexico. Doesn't matter. The Mexicans were able to handle it on their own. This is the same Mexican army that America defeated in like 6 months. The Mexicans were able to defeat the French and kick them out, which should tell you something about the French and their army. Oh, where are les croissants? What is this tortilla? I don't understand. If you go to Mexico City, though, there is a definite Austrian German slant to their cuisine because the guy in the weeds. The guy who took over Mexico was Napoleon III. So this is Napoleon's grandson, I think. Okay? But Napoleon III couldn't be bothered governing Mexico, so he installed a cousin as the ruler of Mexico, and the ruler was Maximilian of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It was a Habsburg. So for 3 years, there's an Austrian leading Mexico. So the cuisine down there, especially in Mexico City, there's a lot of Austrian infusion, like pastry and, layered pastries and stuff like that in the cuisine. If you go down there and look for it, you can find it. I watch a show called, not Mexico, One Plate at a Time, Patty's Mexican Kitchen. I love cooking shows. So I watch Patty's Mexican Kitchen. Patty Hinich, who likes to talk about the cooking that which she is cooking, and she likes to talk about the flan. Oh, she loves the flan. But she is blonde-haired, blue-eyed Mexican because her ancestors are Austrian. She comes from that period. Her family comes from that period of time. It's really fascinating to look at. Anyway, we don't have near amount of time. We could go into a whole thing on Mexican-Austrian fusion cuisine, but we don't have time. How do you make strudel with tortillas? All right. Anyway, Seward in 1867 buys Alaska from the Russians. Now, William Henry Seward, the guy who should have been the Republican nominee in 1860, if that interloper Lincoln hadn't come along. But Seward was Lincoln's Secretary of State, and when Lincoln was assassinated, became Andrew Johnson's Secretary of State. And aside from surviving the night of Lincoln's assassination, when one of the co-conspirators broke into Seward's house, ran upstairs, and stabbed Seward in his bed the same night Lincoln was killed. You did not know that. There were 3 guys. There were 3 guys the night Lincoln was killed. John Wilkes Booth killed Lincoln in Ford's Theater. George Atzerodt was supposed to kill Vice President Johnson and got drunk instead. Chickened out and got drunk. But he was in the bar downstairs in the hotel where Johnson was staying. And the other guy was charged with killing Secretary Seward. Broke into Seward's home, stabbed Seward's son Frederick in the stomach, ran upstairs, jumped on Seward's bed where Seward was convalescing from a wagon accident he had suffered a week previous, and stabbed him in the face. Survived because he had broken his jaw during the wagon accident. He had broken his jaw and had a metal plate in his face to keep his jaw set. That's how he survived. No. Severely wounded, but not killed. So anyway, Seward recovers from this, is still the Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson, and during Johnson's administration, one of the few things that the Johnson administration actually gets done is the purchase of Alaska for $7 million. Everybody thinks Seward is an idiot. It's nothing but snow and ice up there. They call it Seward's Folly or Seward's Icebox. But Seward says, look, we got the Russians out of the Western Hemisphere. And who knows what's up there? Lo and behold, what did they discover there at the end of the century? Oil and gold, both. What's that? All right, so in the rest of the late 18th century, you see an effort on the part of the United States to get Latin American countries to work together to get them on the same page. What's called the Pan-American Conference, and this was started by Secretary of State James Blaine during the Benjamin Harrison presidency. But it's the beginning of something what today is called the Organization of American States. It's the Western Hemisphere countries. They get together at a meeting every year and they work together on trade and stuff like that. But it gets started in the late 1800s. And then Venezuela boundary dispute. Britain owned this piece of land. It's called British Guiana. This is Venezuela. Nobody knows where the boundary was. Britain is threatening to invade Venezuela to assert its rights on the boundary. And the last thing the Cleveland administration needs during the middle of a depression is a British invasion of Latin America. So the Secretary of State, guy by the name of Richard, and your workbook spells it wrong, but Richard Olney, O-L-N-E-Y, he's the Secretary of State for Grover Cleveland's second term. Richard Olney agrees to step in as an arbitrator, as an impartial third party, and says to Britain and Venezuela, okay, let's see if we can hash this out without resorting to invasion. Because, again, this is the idea of keeping European powers from intervening in Western affairs. Okay? So, America asserting itself in the Western Hemisphere. And then, once America has asserted itself in the Western Hemisphere, become the largest economic power in the world, we ask ourselves, where are the new frontiers? We don't look to Europe. We look into the Pacific. That's where the opportunity lies. That's where the opportunity for land, that's where the opportunity for power, that's where the opportunity for money is. And so America turns its attention in the late 19th century to the Pacific. Now we send Commodore Matthew Perry, not him, in the Millard Fillmore administration, of all administrations, Fillmore sends Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan in 1853 to open up Japan to trade. And this is around the time of the Opium Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, spheres of influence, China being carved up between the English and the French and the Germans and the Russians. And America wants in on that. And so we're looking to where the Europeans aren't, and the Europeans aren't in Japan. And so that's why we decide to open up Japan. And when Japan sees these American ships sailing into Edo Bay, what today is Tokyo Bay, they say, well, wow, look at those guns. Wow, aren't they great? Well, whatever you guys want, you got it. And Japan, rather than fall victim to what happened to the Chinese, where they get addicted to opium and where the Europeans are trying to keep China divided, Japan decides it's not going to go the way of China, it's going to modernize. And I know you guys have all talked about the Meiji Restoration, okay? This is when the Meiji Restoration occurs as a result of America going to Japan and forcibly opening it up. And Japan's attitude is, well, if you can't beat them, join them. And they start to modernize and become a modern power, an industrial power, a military power. By 1894, they've already invaded China. America wants access to Chinese markets. America also wants opportunities in the Pacific. For instance, Hawaii is loaded with sugar and pineapple. Americans love sugar and pineapple. Look at us. We're all obese from all the sugar and pineapple we eat. Oh, and by the way, Hawaii's got a really great harbor for a naval base. So wouldn't that be great? America attempts to annex Hawaii in 1892. and it is led by a guy who is in the sugar and pineapple business. His name is Sanford Dole. That's right, the same Dole pineapple that you get on the grocer's shelves. This is where this comes from. Dole does not like the fact that the government of Hawaii wants to limit American access and power in Hawaii. Queen Liliuokalani. Did you know that Hawaii was an independent kingdom? It was. It was an independent country. And we went in there and took it over lock, stock, and barrel because we were greedy for sugar and pineapple. So enjoy your cans of pineapple, people. So anyway, Harrison supported the annexation of Hawaii, but Grover Cleveland opposed it. And what wound up happening was Sanford Dole, and this is the kind of power that business people had back in the day, Sanford Dole called up the War Department and said, "You guys have a cruiser around here that I can borrow?" And they sent the USS Boston to Honolulu, pointed the guns at Honolulu and said, "You're going to surrender to us now." And Hawaii was like, "Hold on a second, let me pull up my grass skirt." Yeah, I mean, they didn't have the ability to fight back against that. But when Dole presented Hawaii to the United States government for annexation, Cleveland, who opposed it, did not want it. And so for about 4 years, Hawaii just kind of swung in the breeze out there. McKinley, however, who is very pro-business, very pro-monopoly, wants to do whatever he can for the business community, he pulls the trigger on Hawaii annexation in 1898, and we take it over lock, stock, and barrel, along with other islands in the Pacific, like Samoa, Guam, eventually the Philippines, Wake Island, Midway Island. All these islands represent, and I know I'm going to go marching past the screen here, all these islands represent, thank you for moving your feet, Timmy, because Timmy knows where I'm going. They all represent stepping stones to Asia. Places where American ships can stop, refuel, relax, and move on, with the ultimate goal being opening economic access to Japan and China. Hawaii is part of that strategy. Now, the defining event of this imperialism in the late 19th century is the Spanish-American War, and why do we go to war with Spain? I would argue, as a historian, because we could. They were easy, low-hanging fruit, okay? Spain was an empire on the decline. We were not going to go to war with Britain or France or even Germany or Italy. Germany and Italy were empires on the rise. Spain has been an empire on the decline for 400 years. And by the late 19th century, all Spain has left of its empire is the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba, and that's it. That's it. Remember when we began this class, Spain ruled the world. Now they're down to 4 territories, and we want all 4. So, we had been eyeing Cuba since the Ostend Manifesto back in the 1850s. During the Pierce administration, we were mainly interested in sugar in Cuba. We were also interested in creating more slave states, but we don't want to talk about that. Now, when we acquired Hawaiian sugar under American companies did not want to have to compete with Cuban sugar. So in 1894, they convinced the Cleveland administration to sign a tariff called the Wilson-Gorman Tariff of 1894. And basically what it did was it outpriced Cuban sugar so that Americans would buy Hawaiian sugar. Does that make sense? Make the Cuban sugar more expensive. Have Americans buy Hawaiian sugar, Dole sugar. And what winds up happening is the Cuban sugar markets tank because Cuba's number one exporter or number one importer of sugar is America. And when America stops buying Cuban sugar, the Cuban market goes kaput. And what winds up happening is you wind up with a revolution. When there's no work for the masses, you know what happens next. They come after El Presidente. And Jose Marti, he's generally, I hate using this term, but he's generally considered to be the George Washington of Cuba. He is the leader of the Cuban independence movement, who is trying to rally support to overthrow the Spanish Governor General of Cuba, a guy by the name of Valeriano Weyler. Now, Marti has got friends in New York, mainly Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, newspaper guys, and Hearst and Pulitzer are more than willing to print stories about Spanish atrocities and Spanish treatment of Cubans and how miserable it is under Spanish rule, because Americans are going to eat that up. They love stories of misery and sex and depravity and blood. So Marti is using his connections in America to convince Americans that something needs to be done in Cuba. By the way, Marti is not down in Cuba. Marti's working out of an apartment in Brooklyn. Okay? But he's leading and coordinating this Cuban independence movement from this apartment in Brooklyn. Now, I know it looks like a lot, it's not. Okay? Emphasizing the role of the newspaper here. Okay? Yellow journalism. We know that Pulitzer and Hearst are masters of yellow journalism. Exaggerated headlines, sensational stories. That's a way to sell newspapers. This Cuban crisis was used as a way of selling newspapers in America. It was part of this Pulitzer-Hearst newspaper war, and Marti was more than happy to help fuel that. Because a lot of the news catered to a very low-cultured, broad audience, low-brow audience, low-information voters. They see pictures like this and they say, my God, something needs to be done. And so what winds up happening is the American public is influenced by the newspapers to put pressure on the politicians, like McKinley, to do something in Cuba. So what does McKinley do? McKinley sends an American ship down to Cuba. Pulitzer and Hearst are going to send photographers and illustrators down, like Frederick Remington. And Remington famously is told by Hearst, you provide the pictures, I'll provide the war.
Today's Tuesday, February 18th, the V-Day. Please stand for your Pledge of Allegiance. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
In celebration of Black History Month, the Social Studies Department presents Black History in America. Bill Pickett, born in 1871, died in 1962, was a renowned cowboy and rodeo performer and was named to the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in 1971 and honored by the U.S. Postal Service in a series of stamps as one of the 20 legends of the West.
All spring athletes.